We're here back with the ever jovial and entertaining Mr. Parker. How are you this evening?
I'm fine, Pierre. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. In this particular video, we're going to go over why we're actually doing this. What sparked your interest in Black history? In conversations, off screen, you spoke about having a curiosity at a very young age.
Yes, very young. And my first hero was Dr. George Washington Carver. He was a scientist and an intellectualist, so to speak, though he didn't talk much. He discovered. He was a great teacher over at Tuskegee University, and he's an African American, by the way.
So this is a separate George Washington.
Oh, this is not our president.
Right. Okay. So we have George Washington Carver.
Yes.
And George Washington. Two separate people.
Two totally separate people. Totally.
Yeah.
George Washington Carver, just to give you an image, he is what we classically today think of when we think of nerdish. Any ethnicity can fit in there, but the nerdy thing. However, due to some kind of an incident, and I don't know how well this goes over with your listeners, he was made a eunuch. It was, so to speak, an accident. He contracted some type of fever early, and just due to how he healed, it interfered with his testicles.
But can we, before we even go any further, can you explain what a eunuch is?
A eunuch is a human being that never reproduces. Its whole purpose in life is other than to breed physically.
Okay.
It can be quite productive, however, its whole purpose in life is never to genetically reproduce itself. Its DNA remains where it is. There are many kinds of eunuchs, made naturally, etc. However, back to George Washington Carver. He was a sickly child. Somehow he came into the hands of a white couple, an older white couple, who had always wanted a child, and they ended up, for all intents and purposes, being his parents, and that's how they thought of themselves. History later tells us he had another opinion, because he became aware of himself as a black person living in the Midwest at the time. But they thought that he was educated as far as it was to go, and other than their taking him in, he probably would have died, and America would never have known one of the greatest inventors of modern times.
So how did you find out about it?
My mother and one of her friends had decided that I was something with something special. Nothing extraordinary. I was never raised to be anything but kind of a parlor child. A child who kind of held a space. You looked nice if you dressed them up. They could recite poems, do little songs, and just be nice, perfect little children. However, my mother thought differently, and when they observed me, when they found I was interested in anything, they allowed me to be intimate with them, ask them any questions, and so they knew what I wanted, and they, to their best, they made many things available to me as a young child. Claudia Victoria, Dotson Long, and my mother.
So they were relatives? Claudia Victoria?
Everybody in the little area around the end of Caddo Lake where we lived were associated with Rollins at some point. There are all kinds of stories, myths, but it was a large place, and it had slaves of its own, and the Dotsons were somehow supposedly related to us through the plantation period. I never could get clarity on all the different peoples, but I did get clear all of the black people that I grew up with had also some kind of cross with Rollins.
So you also spoke about some twists of fate which brought you in contact with black history. Certain things which happened during your life whereby you didn't necessarily have an intention, but certain things came about as a result of things which happened in your life. And you did mention a particular trip to Barbados.
Well, it was a trip through the Caribbean.
Okay.
And Barbados was there. And once I got there, and they had kept all of their archives. You can see them today. They're of storage of that period of the slaves that got through the Middle Passage. And that kind of was it just was kind of a little opener, but at the time I didn't have enough information to put much together. But later I have, because I have seen it. And I used relationships, situations to get to where I thought I needed to go.
Now, Barbados has a particular significance in slavery.
Oh yes, slavery in the New World, we call it.
Yeah.
Barbados, as a Caribbean island, sits the farthest from us, east out into the Atlantic Trench, actually. Africa is on the other end of it. But the same currents that were present 1,000, 2,000 years ago are the currents that are there today. And Barbados sits the furthest out into them. So the winds, if you know how to sail and to triangulate by the tools they had then, you would always end up in Barbados. And so the people who had decided to cut up the New World, they figured this out. And Barbados became the disembarkation place for the distribution of all the slaves, virtually all of the millions of slaves that made it through the Middle Passage through all of the countries, Brazil, Chile. See, people forget that all of these countries have their own slave history as well. The colonial United States is the only one that did something to change the outcome of their effort.
So
Barbados was a disembarkation place.
So slaves weren't going directly to these other countries. They were going to Barbados first, and they were being distributed from there.
You for instance, colonial United States in 1640 had their order was for 450,000 slaves, and it was they were to be delivered from 1640 to 1645. They didn't all come at one time. However, you understand that we're only talking about the 13 original colonies. And they had an order for 450,000 at that time. More men than women, because they were still taming the land in the colonial areas. They were great forests.
So let's get this straight. These are 13 colonies of America.
America.
This is before the United States.
Oh yes, long before. This was from the Pilgrim, that little switch over from the period of the Pilgrims to when the 13 colonies were originally recognized as kind of England's little domain. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about that period when that was the only America there was. There was no Maryland, there was no South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia. That was not yet. That was 100 years or so in the coming.
Okay.
And we just are seeing how the slaves got moved through this great machine. It literally was a great machine. You got moved through it. You come from Jamaica, and they had an order for so many hundreds of thousands. That little island.
Now, we're talking about slavery in Jamaica at some stage.
And I haven't a lot. It just as slavery in other countries brush up against my own. That is my only interest in slavery in other countries, and it's a kind of a narrow-minded way. However, it allowed me to move swiftly through what I thought I needed to know to get known.
But the information that you're passing on is highly relevant because it's almost like a blueprint for slavery in other countries and how it was.
Oh yes,
used.
it's the perfect, and it is used time and time again, except something happened differently in the 13 colonies.
Okay. Now, there are certain people out there who would speculate the importance of knowing about Black history and its relevance. But I believe there's a phrase, you can correct me if I'm wrong, which says, he who is bound by his history.
He who knows not his history is bound to repeat it.
There you go.
And we are on a cycle today in America. And it's as clear as the nose on your face and well documented. We're repeating the same thing that happened in the period of just after the war, Reconstruction. Actually, Reconstruction theoretically even is before the war begins, but we'll just go on. This Reconstruction period, blacks made huge gains out of slavery. They proved themselves to be magnificent military men. They were great adventurers. They reproved themselves after slavery. We had black congressmen, black senators. We had even a black governor. And then, wham, Congress became obstructionist. It sat down, and our government is built on the model of a strong three-pronged stool. Nothing is stronger than that as a base. But each one can block the other through certain tactics. However, what's happening today is the exact thing that happened back in the 1800s. The whites became afraid that they were going to be overrun and misused by the dark people for the evils they had done on the other peoples.
But without going away from the point.
Yes.
This is something which is relevant to black people
Everywhere.
Worldwide. I think we need to really stress that fact, because the thing with slavery, history, racism, the after effects are psychological. They're and that's a lot deeper than the extreme physical.
As extreme as they were, you're right, because it lasts centuries, sometimes longer.
And when we actually get into one of our videos down the line, we'll actually not even touch on, but we'll speak about the direct intention that was set up, that this would have a long-lasting, rippling.
Well, it was of no value if it didn't cripple the person that you were attempting to alter the view of. So it had to, because you threw all your money into it. So they had a plan, and that it was their only plan, but it was brilliant. And we are still having the effects of it today. The way African American men and women, for instance, casually relate today in our society is based upon what happened to us, not only in slavery, but what we thought we knew that was not true.
And again, going back to your life now, you also had a job as a census taker.
Yes, one summer I took a job. Well, it's actually they prep you in the spring, and you it's weird. It's nothing like I thought it was. But the knowledge you gain from seeing how a large country keeps track of its people, and how it figures out, when it says 3%, American families, or the size of an American family is 2.18 persons. Well, how does it come about that? Well, once you've done it, in actuality, you can see, because remember, there was a period in slavery when African Americans were thought of as 3/5 of a white man. And that can be mind-blowing until you see how they train the census taker to look at it. And you can say, I see why they're doing that. But only if you look at it from that demographic kind of point of view. And I had an opportunity to be a census taker. So, I needed a job. But I learned other things that I didn't know were going to actually be important to me understanding my interest. And it has been.
And you're talking about, you told me again off screen, about a particular person who changed his family's race.
Yes, it's an old story, but it happened, and with more regularity than you think. African Americans were always top in their game, no matter what they presented to you. And they knew that all of this, making different races and making quadroons and octoroons was going on, and they had to figure out the way to get them an advantage. So, and they figured it out. You start having people who are, you train them, you send them to school, but you start training them, whether they are really white or not, to do certain things, to pass for whites with a purpose. And
so this is like a second generation octoroon.
Yes, no. This would have been it could have been a first or second generation. It's the attitude of these persons, because these persons aren't going to necessarily be about breeding for anything. They have purpose.
So they look white, but
right, and that's all it has to do is they look white.
Yeah. So they're accepted, and they
get a job as a census taker. And they have to. In those days, there were no cars. You got your mule. You had to go. You had so much paper, and you went around counting. Well, what some of these people would do, they got to be known as white, but they knew who their people were. And as long as you had on that census form that you were whatever your race was, you could use that as a pass for a long time in America. So many times you had the census taker was indeed an undercover African American, and he was doing something for his family as well. Now he might get trapped where he was, meaning he can't come home anymore. He can't stop this shield he has on. So it's not like passing is always a great thing.
So he's making a sacrifice.
He's making... Now, looking at it from the other side, people don't think it's a sacrifice. But if you think you're never going to see your family and intimates as intimates again, it may happen by some fluke, but most likely you lived your life. There are stories of it from the time of Thomas Jefferson all the way to now, where people chose this. And it was no doubt these people their families worked to put them in these positions. So I was a census taker. and I just got the experience of there's a power, in having to be able to mark things down. But for African Americans, a lot of times they were able to help their families.
So what would they put on these race cards to help the family?
Well, let's say you were a quadroon. You could easily be a quadroon that's from the Eastern Europe, and you got changed from when that you were black or colored or whatever to white. As simple as that.
And that would open.
Oh,
doors.
that could open universities. That could open marriages. That could open the receipt of property in the ability to vote. Just having that.
Yeah.
It's no different than we have these so-called conservatives wanting to make it harder for people to be identified, to be able to vote. Because it used to be you just had to be a white male. Period. So if you could pass for a white male, you can imagine some of the things that were accomplished. But you see, the problem with it is many people would get trapped. It isn't easy or sometimes even possible to come back, because you will cause more damage. And so you stay where you are. So that's just, I was not, as I grew, a very well adjusted person. I mean, I knew that I always had that there had to be something more than this, but I still was curious. And no matter what I got involved in, I would follow my interest. And at the time, I thought it nothing. But I'd always be we're on a search of something about African American history or African history in the Americas.
Now, you did tell me that when you were coming across certain pieces of information, there would often be blanks or gaps.
Yes, blanks they're not explained. There is nothing in the text that explains this period.
And if you had teachers, the teachers didn't know.
Because they hadn't been taught. Or they had been taught you can't say anything about this.
But you used your initiative.
I used my initiative. I was a nerdy little boy beyond belief also. And I would always wangle my way, for instance, to volunteer in the library. But there was always a cage where I went to school where there were books locked behind the cage that you had to have special permission to see these books. And some of these books were old African American poetry, or they had references to old African American things. And so now very few people got to see them. But because I couldn't make friends with other kids too well, but I liked to read, and this took me into another world, and I was interested in this genre, I would get behind that place sometimes and read for hours and hours and hours. But now it's part of the things that I know. So,
but by doing that and having that level of inquisitiveness, you were able to fill in those holes which were there.
Eventually.
Yeah. But it's taken a lot. And
it's taken...
the majority of your life?
Yes, well, the summer of 2012. When it was like a bell happened. And everything fell in place.
And you have touched on this before, but what happened in the summer of 2012?
Over the television, general announcement, like they often do in U.S. in NewsHour, something came down from the National DNA Laboratory, which is at Harvard, up around Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it was this announcement that African American DNA will, from this point forward, be recognized as the tracer DNA of all American DNA. It was just an announcement that was kind of crazy, and the name is that, but I knew what it meant.
it had very large implications, did it not?
Well, how did you get to be the tracer? What had to happen to make it so? It was easy to you do an autopsy. You dissect the knowledge you've heard. How did it get to be? What did it mean? Can I reference it to anything? And I had lots of little points I could reference it to, and it fit a hole. And everything else I was clear of. So this event had happened.
But what would that mean to the layperson?
If they weren't interested, it could mean almost nothing to absolutely nothing.
Right.
Because it's if you do not understand African American history in America, and I find maybe after they were teaching us, and I learned in school, and my mother's then passed stuff to me, so they were taught something, and they were encouraged something in me. But today, I guess it's not taught anymore. But for us, we know what it means. Now the facts are in place. All you have to do is deconstruct what they've just given you. And I just gave you how to deconstruct. There are a few questions. They're inquiries. And you must answer them in such a way that they are, everything is affirmative.
But by being the tracer DNA, that means that...
It means that, well, for us, it meant that, first of all, none of the male DNA, see, that came out too. That none of the African DNA that came initially, none of the male.
From the males. Mm-hmm.
And that almost was a tearjerker and a crazy maker, because none.
So none of the males.
DNA of the males who came with those females.
From Africa.
450,000, most male. So we're not talking about just 225,000. It were more males.
Mm-hmm. This is 1640.
1640 to 45.
450,000.
And that's 372 years or something ago.
Yeah. So we're saying, just for the facts, between 1640 and 1645.
We got our allotment.
450,000 slaves, the majority of the male, came over.
More males than females. You add in a little something to it. You just say what it was. It was more male than female.
Yeah, the majority, yeah. But none of that DNA...
From the males. Comes down to me today.
Which means at some stage...
Somehow the male DNA had to be... disappeared to be kind, and that can only happen, a minimum of certain ways when you're talking about what we're talking about. We're not talking about foxes and cats. We're talking about our forefathers and such.
So, but if we're going to be pragmatic about this, we're talking about death or destruction, removal of these males.
They were removed. And they were removed such that none of their DNA could come down. However, we know of the work they did.
We'll pause with that. Now, regarding the tracer DNA, the fact that the black or African American DNA can be used as a tracer DNA means that
what happened was we have a very important common group of ancestors, and for us in antebellum America, that means African people, white people, and what we have is one that's common as the male, and he ain't black. None of the African DNA is present in ours today. But all of ours have tidbits and traces. When I say ours, I mean antebellum African Americans. And that's the majority of the 30 million blacks that are more or less counted in America today. Mm-hmm. They have traces. They can trace themselves back to the antebellum South. before the war. Even counting for a lot of the immigration from other countries and other Caribbean countries that's going on. The antebellum black still makes up the large amount of African Americans. So what we're saying is, I can give you a scenario. All the males were separated from the females through some process, and they were sent off. We know they accomplished great works. That's documented in our history. It's just that's another hole. Well, they did this, but where are they? Who are they? How? They talks about how they set up a big plantation house. And anyway, all of the males were removed, and they did their work. Females were doing whatever females do. But what we're finding is, and this is a disappearance and it's a little bit of a leap, we believe they were worked to death and then thrown into trenches, large pits, all over colonial America now. So this was something that was thought about and planned by all of them.